Welcome everybody to today's webinar. Our guest today is Daniel Crumback, and he's an internationally respected leader and expert in physiological testing, data analysis, and exercise program design. And he's got over 30 years of experience working with medical, general, and athletic populations. He's a clinical exercise physiologist, a high performance specialist, strength and conditioning specialist, and sport physiotherapist. And this kind of gives Daniel a unique perspective on testing and training. Daniel's had a highly successful 29-year career in the Canadian Armed Forces, and he was recruited to China as the Director of Rehabilitation and Performance, where he taught exercise physiology, physiotherapy, and performance coaching throughout China. And he was also working with provincial, national, and Olympic athletes in a variety of sports. Daniel is also a CEO of Strategic Sport Performance, and he is Sport and Wellbeing Coordinator, and he also lectures at Chichester University in the UK at the Institute of Sport, Nursing and Allied Health. And besides that, he works as an expert consultant for PNOE, which is a US-based company that does metabolic analysis, and also for IDIG, which is a Swiss company, and they're the makers of the P100 respiratory training device. And if you want to know more about Daniel, you can find out more on his website, strategicsportperformance.com, or you can find him on LinkedIn. So a warm welcome to you, Daniel. It's a pleasure to have you with us.
Yeah, gladly. So it's been a long journey. So everything that I've moved into is because I felt that there was a hole that I didn't know enough about. So I started off as a physiotherapist and then a sport physiotherapist, and then realized my knowledge of physiology was not where it needed to be. Then I started doing a lot more physiological testing, and then realized that my strength conditioning and performance knowledge was not up. So then I went and did all of that as well. And it does give me a unique perspective because of the fact that I can come from all sides. And you're not only be able to identify limitations, whether they're respiratory or metabolic or cardiovascular, but also if they're neuromuscular, and that ability to be able to then address those issues. It's the best time. Sorry, I have the best system now after 25, 30 years for being able to test people's physiology, be able to identify limitations, be able to zone people accurately and give them a precise program that will improve their function and performance.
That sounds really good. So the metabolic testing, the metabolic analysis, that's something that you're really into. So what does it measure? Why is it important? Just give us a bit more detail on that.
Well, the traditional view is that it measures O2 and CO2 gases that you expire to get an idea of what's going on inside the body during exercise and also during rest, in the case of doing a resting metabolic rate. So by measuring those gases and other metrics, we can determine what type of fuel that you're burning, how much fuel that you're burning. And during an RMR, that is the gold standard for being able to identify a resting metabolic rate. It's what everybody else tries to get close to, whether it's a fancy scale or whatever, but everybody's trying to reach that standard, which is of course extremely important when you're dealing with people with weight loss issues, but also being able to do things like a ramp test or an endurance-based test to be able to identify performance limitations. And the metabolic analysis allows you to be able to look at each system involved. So it's not about finding out that you need to run faster. It's why can't you run faster is all in there, and therefore it gives you the ability to be able to prescribe the right exercise, give the right nutrition specific to that individual to improve them and achieve their goals.
Normally you look at single measurements. You look at like VO2 max or anaerobic threshold or whatever, but this is a different system. You're looking at a more complex, or you have a more holistic view. Why is that better than just looking at single measurements?
Well, that's my view. If you, this is a comment like through my metabolic analysis certification program. There's a lot of masters in exercise science and PhD in exercise science that take my course. And they said they learned more in my courses than they learned in the 3 or 5 years in school. And it's because it's taught academically. So in other words, you're looking for VT1, or which represents this, and you're looking for VT2, which is this, or you're getting a VO2 max so that you can determine where they fit in ranking, and also so that you can multiply it by percentages, so that you can determine zones. And anytime that you have a single metric, I think it limits the amount of data you're actually collecting during the testing. So, if you're doing, let's say, a 9 to 12 minute ramp test, why are you looking for 3 or 4 points along there? Things like anaerobic threshold. So what I've looked at is said, this isn't important. And in fact, nobody really, these are surrogates for something that's happening in your body. So I like to tear those down and throw them out, because frankly, I don't even know what anaerobic threshold means. There's actually no such thing as anaerobic threshold. It is when you're changing from one fuel source to another. Mm-hmm. So with O2 and CO2, you can see fuel utilization, and it doesn't happen at one point. So instead of building an algorithm, math, to apply to a scientific test over 12 minutes, why not look at the trending and be able to see, using multiple metrics, something that directly determines when they're changing fuel sources, because that's what matters, because the fuel source switches, where they happen, will give you accurate zones, but it'll also identify potential limitations in efficiency or their metabolism's ability to use fat and oxygen, delivery versus utilization. All that information gets thrown out when you do a kind of a VO2 max test. And the only data you use are these points, these single points found by an algorithm. So
when you measure this, do you measure that live?
Yes. Okay. That's what's really nice. If you wish, I can share my screen about the kind of information that we can collect. But it's really every device, every metabolic analyzer, as long as it has O2 and CO2 capability. There's a lot of metabolic analyzers out there with only O2, and that has severe limitations. You cannot look at nutrition without the CO2, and frankly, you can't look at recovery well without CO2. So I'm talking about a proper metabolic analyzer with O2 and CO2 sensors. But the kind of information, you'd have to approve me to share a screen. So what I would do is say that the kind of information that, and the way that I teach people how to analyze it, gives them a much clearer idea of exactly what's going on at multiple levels, because metabolic analysis, you've got to be able to understand the cardiovascular, the metabolic, and the respiratory systems, and the interactions, the complex interactions, to be able to clearly see what's going on. And if you cannot be able to bring up these multiple metrics and look at them in conjunction, then you really can't tell what's going on.
Yeah, that totally makes sense.
So you should be looking at this is a ramp test result. So this is a 26-year-old, 72 kilo, 165 centimeter female. This represents, it's a treadmill test. So this is a 3-minute warm-up at 5 kilometers an hour, and then a 9 to 12 minute step test, followed by 2.5 minutes of recovery. And this is inactive recovery. On the screen, I just have the speeds and the heart rate for now. But what you can see is on the pull down menus, you can bring up any combination of metric that I wish to look at, which allows me to put up multiple metrics at a time. So for example, specific to the respiratory system, I can bring up VT and BF, so breathing frequency and the volume that they're breathing per breath, and be able to see how they performed over the whole test. So this is increasing intensity throughout. It allows me to be able to see not only the volumes that they move, so 2.24 liters per breath, or here, 2.69 liters per breath, but also the frequency that they're using. They're at 48 breaths per minute here. And I can see what breathing method that they use. So this person brings in their volume early. A lot of people don't. They're breathing at a lower level with almost full volume at reasonable frequencies at a low intensity, but they immediately jump to what I would consider a high frequency for a low intensity. And so this person is hyperventilating at that level of effort.
Mm-hmm.
And in this case, you can see that they're not capable of changing their volume significantly. And therefore, they must go to breathing frequency to be able to get their volume or their VE up.
Mm-hmm.
So this is a classic case of somebody who's hyperventilates because they lack volume. So the problem with hyperventilating at lower intensities is it makes it difficult for the oxygen to unload at the muscle cell.
Mm-hmm.
So in this particular case, they're actually going to deliver oxygen on the hemoglobin. Because they're hyperventilating, they're going to be hypocapnic or have low CO2 levels at the muscle cell, meaning that without the higher concentration gradient of carbon dioxide, the hemoglobin is going to leave with the oxygen adhered to it. It requires that concentration gradient. So this person's not going to be able to use oxygen well at the muscle, not necessarily because there's a problem at the muscle. It's a problem with the respiratory system.
Mm-hmm.
And so what's interesting with this is I recommend that all people test with spirometry. And this person actually has low spirometry scores for FVC, or forced functional capacity, the kind of functional amount of maximum amount of air they have in their lungs, as well as their forced expiratory volume in 1 second, how much air they can move in 1 second. So both of those are low. By looking at their numbers, I can see that their volumes are maximized from their limited capacity. They can't breathe any better. So if you don't change their breathing volumes that they can move, they're going to consistently have this problem. This is just some of the interesting stuff specific to the respiratory system.
Yeah, we're going to get back to the respiratory system in a minute, but you are looking at other systems as well, aren't you? Yeah,
so in the case, of course, for the cardiovascular system, probably the most well-known is the VO2 max. So the ability to bring up the VO2 and be able to see what their VO2 is. In this particular case, this is their VO2 line. You can tell this is a VO2 max because the CO2, the O2 plateaus, and they're at a very high score. They're at 30 milliliters per minute, and you have to divide it by their kilogram weight to get their VO2. So they have a fairly good cardiovascular system. And the other thing that we use for cardiovascular is what's referred to as VO2 pulse. Mm-hmm. And what you're looking with VO2 pulse, it's a very well-respected measurement of cardiac function, is the fact that the VO2 pulse represented here at heart rate here should stay linear. And you can see that it's certainly not linear. This should be going up equally for every beat going up. So this person has a cardiovascular limitation above 145 beats. So we know, I could tell from this is not necessarily a heart problem. This person is severely detrained and would benefit for, in this particular case, the best zone to train in is zone 3 for cardiovascular strength. So I could tell just from this, I'm going to do some zone 3 intervals with this individual and respiratory training to increase volumes. The other things you can look at that are, if we look at metabolic, as obviously we think of how well they can use fat and carbohydrate. Fat's represented here, carbohydrate here. How late they switch in the test over to a mainly carbohydrate. is an indication of the kind of their low level intensity efficiency. And you can tell this person likes to train low intensity. So they cross over at 142, which is good. You can even look at the amount of fat they can burn. 6.7 kilocalories per minute is not bad. So I can already tell this person is one of those people that like to go out and do long distance, low intensity work, but does not like working hard. And I could tell that just by looking at their results. That would also be supported by looking at their efficiency through different ranges, and that's VO2 over breathing frequency. And you can see here, it's completely flat. Normally, this will be raised in areas in which they're more efficient. This is represented by milliliters per breath. How much oxygen are they using per breath? So 67 milliliters per breath. That's really low, and it's low all the way along, meaning that I could train this person basically anywhere and get them better. And it may be because of the respiratory limitation, not allowing them to train as hard as they need to. If I got them to train harder, their respiratory limitation would not get better, and they would just struggle.
So what's the respiratory limitation? How do you define that?
Yeah, so that's respiratory capacity. So I describe everything as being a capacity limitation or a capability limitation. Mm-hmm. And capacity, like its definition, is the volume that something can hold. So it has to do with lung size, and the ability to be able to use it is capability. So capability represents the ability to use something. That is how well they use their capacity or volume during activity. She had a respiratory capacity limitation as determined through spirometry. So we did spirometry looking for their lung volumes and how much air they can get out powerfully in 1 second. And both of them were low. In fact, they were 89% of normal for FEV1 and 86% of normal for FVC. And that's normal based upon the predicted in the GLI, which is the general population. So it's not athletes that should get that number. Athletes should get a significantly higher number. So this person, when they start running, if you can't create those volumes at rest, how can you use them well during activity? And in this particular case, she uses her volumes as well as she can. So she uses 75 to 85% of her FEV1 during activity. We can't expect her to do more than that. So if we can identify a capacity versus a capability limitation, then we need to train them differently.
So if you say she uses them as best as she can, then is that a capability issue?
No, so because she has limited capacity, so spirometry at rest, right? We take her actual numbers and we calculate it into what's referred to as their peak VT. Mm-hmm. So in her particular case, 2.69 liters. Her FEV1 was 3. Normal is 3.37. So you stack those numbers and you realize she's using 2.69 of 3. Mm-hmm. You can't use much more than that of an FEV1 while you're busy running on a treadmill. Yeah. The respiratory system has many other roles besides just breathing. So the stress on that system, if you get 85% of your FEV1, then you have good capability. So in this particular case, she has good capability for volume, but she hyperventilates. Okay. If I asked her to not breathe as fast, she would just simply won't move the volume necessary to continue running. So there's no sense addressing this test. What we have to do is go back to the spirometry test and say, we need to increase your FBC and your FEV1 by at least a half a liter, and then get you to apply it during activity.
So how would you do this? How would you help her increase the volume?
Well, this is a very interesting approach. Like it's been years. I've been working on respiratory training for over 25 years, and all these concepts have come through my experience. And part of it, this is my strength and conditioning coming over and saying, all right, so if you want to add volume, then what's going to happen if you add resistance? If you make it more difficult, is you're going to get better at breathing lousy volume, right? And the problem with that is you've got a system with mobile ribs and thorax and a diaphragm that demands that it's able to move. It needs mobility. It needs to be pulled down to increase intrathoracic pressure to be able to get the air down into the lower parts of the lung. If you had resistance to it, you're going to stiffen that system, and you're going to cause mobility issues, and you're going to make it harder for them to move volume. So this is where I go against most people's theory that you just simply give them resistance. Like this is the whole theory between IMT. That's how it started. Just add resistance, make it more difficult for them, and they'll strengthen their diaphragm. But if I took somebody into the gym and said, well, I want it for it to be functional, I need you to move through full range. It'd be the equivalent of giving somebody quarter squats when they need full squats. You're only going to be stronger in the range in which you're working. There'll be some crossover, but really, I've got to get you to move through the full range. So I don't apply the theory of adding resistance as making sense. Resistance is added to be able to increase strength, but it should not be applied to adding volume. So
to add, does this mean you have to adjust your breathing pattern first? Because there's a lot of talk about readjusting, retraining your breathing pattern back to a normal pattern that you actually use your muscle range that you have. Yeah,
what's funny is I don't find when I'm training people, less than 10% of the people need to be retaught to breathe diaphragmatically. It's a big fad right now of getting people on the ground and teaching them diaphragmatic breathing. Sure. Why don't you train them as they normally would and find out how they breathe first? Observe them during activity. And if they're breathing fine, they're using normal patterns, then great, leave them the hell alone. But this concept of I'm going to lie you on the ground and I'm going to get you to belly breathe, and it's somehow going to adapt to you being upright and moving against stress when there's a huge requirement for increasing volumes and frequencies, is just a joke. So I do use it, but I use it on everybody. It's about 10% of my population where I just go, they're still breathing apically. They're just, shoulders are going up and it's been too long. They have the wrong neuromuscular coordination. Then I'll bring them back down and move them. I usually use what's referred to as the 4-4 matrix. And I move them from the ground into standing, and then I train them. But sometimes it's mobility issues, right? If the thorax and the ribs can't move properly, if they can't elevate and move out during inhalation, and they can't depress and move in during exhalation, then it doesn't matter how hard the muscle hauls on it. If the structure can't move, it can't move. So I always do mobility tests. And again, I use different tests through the SFMA, the Selective Functional Movement Assessment, to determine whether they have normal movement and bilaterally. And if they do, I don't train it. It's what I call respectful training. I don't make people do diaphragmatic breathing when they know how. I don't make them do mobility exercises when they don't need it. And you should have tests to determine who needs them. So if they have normal mobility and they lack volume, then what you want to be able to do is get them to move more volume. And this is where I have some issues where a lot of devices will measure pressure. And I understand why. It's less expensive. And you can use algorithms to kind of guess the volume they're moving based upon the pressure over the duration of the pressure. The biggest problem I have is they don't use duration, right? It's hard. Again, it requires an advanced device to be able to measure volume. And just because their peak pressure or average pressure increases doesn't mean their volume changed. But
that makes sense.
Yeah. It's a surrogate, and I understand, but if we had pressure over time, I would believe in that a lot more.
So let's go back to the respiratory limitations. We want to touch briefly on that because we are running tight on the time. So because we like to, we're PN Medical, we believe in respiratory muscle training, so we like to talk about breathing quite a lot. So if you identify a respiratory limitation, what do you do?
So if it's a capacity limitation, it'll either be one of two types. They don't have good FEC, or they can't move the volumes they should, or they can't expire powerfully. And believe it or not, that's more common in athletes than a lack of volume. And very, if we think of a medical community, we think of asthma, the inability to exhale because of constriction. But if I picked one athletic population, it'd be triathletes. They spend so much time in the pool being able to maintain a certain amount of air in their lungs to maintain buoyancy, to make them efficient in the water, that they never learn to breathe out powerfully. And if any swimmer just thinks about how they exhale in the water, they'll know exactly what I mean. But that type of training stiffens the system, and then you watch them move over to the bike and they continue to breathe like they're in the water. So if you can, how I would train an FEV1 or a forced expiratory power limitation would be, remember what the word power means. And that's work over time. So the idea is it's explosive. So therefore the training needs to be more explosive. I need to move a maximum volume in 1 second. And why is FEV1? Why do I pick it? Is because at the highest intensities, the breathing frequency is around 50 to 55 breaths per minute. It's the best surrogate number to be able to pull from spirometry that would be functional during activity. Now, respiratory capability limitation is the inability to use the volume that they have if they have good volume, and that or hyperventilation. And they're not synonymous. Just because you have low volumes during activity does not mean you hyperventilate. And just because you have good volume doesn't mean of that is coordination training. Trying to coordinate the breathing at the right frequencies, at the right intensities. So if we look at that, obviously what we want is for you to access your volume early and not hyperventilate in zone 2 and 3. Otherwise, you'll become hypocapnic and screw up how your muscle's working. And not to lose volume at higher frequencies when the intensity goes high. So you need to be able to breathe a good volume at 45, 50, 55 breaths a minute. So through metabolic analysis, you can see that happening. And with a respiratory training device, you can, and a metronome, you can train them to breathe the right frequency and the right volumes during certain workouts.
How do you use the respiratory device for that?
All right. Well, traditionally, since 2000, that allowed me to be able to set frequencies and volumes. Right now, my respiratory training device of choice is the IDAG P, because of the fact that I can train for as long as I want to train them, because there's a CO2 sensor and allows them not to get dizzy. I can set the metronome for any frequency, and it accurately measures volume. Problem is, it's $1,200 US per device, which means that it's prohibitive for a lot of people. It's more of open a respiratory training facility and bring people in to do it. So what I like to be able to do is find a device, and this is what we've been discussing, in which we can get accurate surrogates for volume, but build in a metronome that would allow us to be able to give the right type of training: capacity, 2 types; capability, 2 types of limitation; training completely different depending on the limitation. And therefore we'd have the best effect with each person.
So because you want the volume there as well, so would you use a device such as the Breather Fit, which doesn't have the volume as it is, but is more affordable?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I can't, I know what's best, but what percentage of the population can I help? I still have all these tests of people that say, well, I can't afford $1,200. So how do we train them? And the ability to be able to train inspiration and expiration, your device does it. The ability to adjust resistance levels, your device does it. So it allows me just to say, well, add a metronome to that. So you can get a metronome on your phone, and we can give out this style of training to people. And we're kind of crossing our fingers that the volume is going to be there. But hopefully there'll be developments over the next few years in which we can get an accurate measurement of volume as well.
We've the Breather Fit comes through with the Breather Coach app now, so it kind of has the metronome, because you get the cues of how long you should inhale and exhale. We need to get with you offline to look at our training plans and optimize them. I think that would be fantastic.
Excellent.
As we're running short on time, Daniel, thank you so much. And I think we move on to the questions, because we've got a question here that came from Taylor, and asking, is the risk of a stressed endocrine response to high intensity exercise in a fasted state too much to overcome for a client focused on body recomposition, hypertrophy, and decreased adipose? That's a very specific question.
It is. Let's see if I've got this. Okay. In a fasted state. Why are they in a fasted state? So yeah, Taylor. All right. So Taylor loves
training fasted.
Okay. Loves training fasted.
That's the early morning, hitting the gym early in the morning, straight after getting up, I guess.
Yeah, and you know what? As far as I'm concerned, it's not a good way to train your body at high intensity work. The problem is that you'll have a drop in carbohydrate and protein availability overnight, but your fat availability will actually stay fairly good. I don't have any problem with somebody going up and saying, I hate eating in the morning, and going out and doing a zone 2 workout, because they're essentially, I've done that for years. You do high intensity, and what'll happen is if you have that stress on your body and a lack of carbohydrate available, then you are going to cause a metabolic stress, and you are going to get a response to that is negative. It's catabolic, it's not anabolic. So I would not suggest to anyone that training fasted makes any sense. Some people think it's good for metabolic flexibility. All right, let me get something straight. The food that you eat has nothing to do with metabolic flexibility. That is a lie that's been put out there for years. How can you tell me why your cells would burn fat better when there's nothing on board? The limitation on burning fat is because either you could have a respiratory limitation that could limit your O2 and fat utilization, but in most cases, it is mainly because your cell itself, at the muscle cell, cannot use oxygen and fat well. And it's probably because you've done too much training at high intensity. Because doing training at zone 3 and 4, where a lot of people do their training, decreases mitochondrial density and capillarization. You're actually going to make your systems worse by doing zone 3 and 4. And I could point to CrossFit community, Peloton community. Nobody's working out in zone 5. They're lying. They're working in 3 and 4 all the time. And what they're doing is, sure, you might be pretty and you might be functional and get a 50-pound bag of potatoes in the back of your car, but you're not healthy, because you need that mitochondrial density pillarization to be healthy. So if you think that you're going to change, the last question here is, there's nothing left to burn besides fat. That's the other lie. The fact is that you cannot burn something at the muscle that it cannot burn. So you work in zone 4 and you're going to be all carbohydrates, 90% carbohydrates, 10% fat. It's still going to be that. And you guess where it's going to go? It's going after your protein, buddy. It's going after your protein. So all you're going to do is you're going to break down your muscle mass by doing that. So please don't train fasted. It's okay if you get up in the morning and you want to go out for a zone 2 run or ride, because you can see just from looking at metabolic analysis that if you have good fat burning ability, you're going to burn mainly fat.
So can I just ask, kind of to wrap it up, is there the optimal exercise that you would recommend?
For
what?
What?
If you say this is the optimal exercise for most people to do, can you generalize it like that?
Never, and it's done way too much. So for example, they say for obesity, you need to do HIIT and resistance training. Going, oh, good God, that's not true at all. If you have a high RMR, in other words, in comparison to others, your age, gender, height, and weight, your RMR is at a fast rate. Don't do resistance with them. You're wasting their time. If you do HIIT with them, they'll burn all carbohydrate and no fat. Great if you want to burn calories, but you're not going to help them achieve their goal. And if they lack the cellular structures to burn fat, changing their diet's not going to change their cellular structures. So remember, metabolic flexibility is about training. It's not about food. Thank you. That was a lot to take in today. And we're getting some interesting comments. I think people really will appreciate the input, and they'll have a lot to think about. Last question before I let you go, Daniel. If someone's interested in metabolic analysis, find out whether they have respiratory limitations, where can they go for more information? All right. So obviously, I'll tell people, if you want to have a look, go to www.pnoe.com, P-N-O-E. That's the platform you saw, and the company I've worked with for 2 years and continue to work with as their science education expert. You can also go to Strategic Sport Performance. That's my personal website for my business. And I just do consultancy now. So I work with athletes and coaches and scientists to improve their abilities to do metabolic analysis. I would also suggest that if you're interested in learning a lot more about metabolic analysis, that you have a look at my metabolic analysis certification program. And that includes continuing education credits from ACSM, NASM, and AFAA. So with that, I give over 26 hours of education, all the way from exercise physiology through to testing and data analysis and limitation identification, through to training programs for any type of limitation, including a large portion in Inspire 360. If you're interested, obviously, the Breather Coach is a great option. And if you're interested in the P100, that's idiag.com, IDIAG.com. And you can have a look at that device. And I'm hoping that we can continue to work together to kind of develop that midline device that we can use with a lot more people. Yeah, I think that sounds exciting. I'm looking forward to that. So Daniel, thank you so much for being with us today. That was fantastic. Thank you everyone who listened today. I think there will be a lot of interest in this webinar. So this webinar will be available on demand very soon on the PN Medical website. If you go to Breather University, all our webinars are available on demand there. And we're going to send out the link to all attendees as well.
So yeah, thanks again, Daniel. Thank you for the audience. It was really exciting, and I'm looking forward to the next one.
Thank you for the opportunity.
Have a good rest.
Thanks everyone for attending.
Have a good rest of the day, everyone. Thank you. Bye.